Hello! Today I'm taking a brief look at the Final Fantasy VII Remake, not so much as a comprehensive review, which is something I'll be doing shortly, but more as an initial discussion piece regarding the story and events following my first playthrough. Now, in recent episodes I mentioned how I've opted to consider the Final Fantasy VII Remake as a separate instalment rather than a replacement or modernisation of the 1997 release, owing to Square stating that they're going to be changing aspects of the story. But what I hadn't anticipated until I'd played the game was just how much the narrative shifts seem like they're down to in-world meddling rather than a renewed creative direction by the developers. And as I'll explain in a moment, I went through a range of emotions and rationalizations while I was playing the game that ultimately remain open because it is only the first of several installments, but have left me feeling like this game can't be viewed as anything other than a continuity of the series rather than an adaptation or replacement of the 1997 game. And the upshot is that it seems like it's Sephiroth rather than Square that's retconning this story, which has the potential to be awesome, I think. And if we consider the title of Remake, meaning that it's not just a remade game, but also within the in-world setting, it is in fact a remade history. It goes to such meta levels of self-awareness and cleverness that I have a confidence that they know where they're going with this. Now, before I jump into my observations on this, it's prudent to note that, of course, some events have been adapted by Square, such as the introduction of Leslie, Chocobo Sam, and so on. And they've embellished the story with some cool stuff, such as the redesigns of Genova's casing, and we have Hojo suggesting that Aerith should get bred with S or G-type soldiers in a Crisis Core reference, rather than suggesting that she mate with Red 13, which was probably a healthy retcon. And we have a few other bits like this, but for the most part, I think many of the core narrative changes reside in events being changed by in-lore characters. So, winding it back and looking at this game and how my perceptions changed towards it during my initial playthrough, the first major shift in storytelling was Sephiroth's premature appearance, which occurs moments after we finish the first bombing mission. And as I say, I was trying to look at this game as a fresh experience, but having Sephiroth show up in the first hour to goad Cloud about how he killed his mother, it seemed like a big step change that was completely at odds with the enigmatic mystique and eerie, unknowable nature of Sephiroth, which in many ways is the essence of his character in Final Fantasy VII, and he's much more of an idea than a tangible entity for much of the original game, and even across wider compilation material. He doesn't really appear that much or give much away. So the way I initially rationalised this was that the writers were probably trying to introduce Sephiroth to first-time players and set up this antagonist early, because if we consider his subtle pacing and his late reveal in the original game, which I discussed in my recent Sephiroth episode, retaining this pacing would mean that we wouldn't glimpse him until the flashback, which occurs an hour after the remake installment ends. So it made sense for this staggered episodic storytelling to try and lay the foundations for core characters, early on, and build on from that. Another thing that struck me about Sephiroth's appearance, however, is that he's known to be this godlike, unsurpassable entity in both the original and the remake. And where the original shows him not really caring about Cloud, because to his mind Cloud is simply an inferior, failed experiment that's barely worth considering, the way he purposefully appears to Cloud and actively antagonises him about his mother and periodically haunts him in the remake, it initially jarred with me because it doesn't align with Sephiroth's aims and intentions, which is entirely focused on reuniting with Genova and conquering the planet. So his preoccupation with the existence of Cloud initially seemed quite strange to me, which did change by the time I got to the end. So, playing through to the end, there's plenty of opinions, theories, and degrees of positive and negative reception to this. But for my part, I feel trying to view this game as a standalone entry or a replacement entry to the 1997 release is wrong, and the events have completely shifted my perception of who this game is targeting and what the story is attempting to do. For example, there's been plenty of discussion about how this remake is an opportunity for a new generation of gamers to discover the epic story of Final Fantasy VII. And while roughly 95% of the core game events do align with the first act of the original, the crucial 5% that's different, and the things that these changes imply and foreshadow, in my opinion, only really make sense, or at least make much more sense, if you're aware of the original story. For example, barring the periodic flash-forwards in Cloud's mind to images of Aerith's death and so on, we have changes such as Biggs and Wedge surviving the platefall, and where, from the perspective of a first-time player, they might be like, "Oh, that's nice, they survived, let's move on." The implications for a legacy player are knowing that these guys are supposed to be dead. They should have died, but they didn't. And upon completing the remake, it's hinted that rather than being a flimsy narrative cop-out by Square, where everyone gets to survive and the stakes have been lowered to like a PG-13 level, someone or something in this game world, which seems to be Sephiroth, has created a causal shift in reality that has derailed canonical events from their predetermined path to create a tangent timeline. And in my opinion, this has the potential to be awesome, but it also makes the most sense and has the most emotional weight and significance if you're aware of the predetermined path that this tangent reality has branched from in the first place. Hence the suggestion that the remake works best as a sequel rather than a straightforward retelling. And digressing slightly, I was watching Avengers Endgame the other night, and it's a worthwhile parallel because in this movie we see all manner of time meddling and the Infinity Stones and implied tangent universes and altered character arcs that again make the most sense if you've seen these standalone superhero origin stories and all the previous movies. And by suggesting a causal shift and altered events, the audience needs to be aware of the core events that transpired in the first place and what might be gained or lost from them. Further to the thematic significance of Biggs and Wedge surviving, we have more obvious callbacks to the legacy title in the form of Ketchi's momentary cameo during the platefall segment, which would probably have first-time gamers sat there during the credit roll thinking, so what the hell was that cat thing? And more importantly, we have Zack Fair's big reveal in the final 30 minutes or so, which, even as a returning fan trying to look at this as a fresh experience, I was like, how is anyone starting out with this game going to make sense of this? Which, on the one hand, it creates an intriguing correlation with Zack's appearance in the original game, where we were equally wondering who the hell this guy is. But in the instance of the remake, the further implication of Zack's appearance is that he has the potential to survive past events. And once more, it only really has an emotive or logical impact if we are looking at the remake as a continuity of existent material rather than a replacement of it. Now, moving on, the contrary view and slightly more dubious opinion of the remake story is that Square simply isn't sure where they are going with it. And I was talking to my friend who I've been lifelong fans of Final Fantasy with, and his response to the game story is a little less optimistic, because although he enjoyed the game as a whole, he feels that Square have simultaneously attempted to appeal to new fans, while at the same time trying to appeal to traditional fans at the same time. And by doing so, they've just created a slightly muddled, ambiguous story, which has purposefully been left open. with this changeable fate story arc, because they're waiting to see, how the game's received, and that's going to inform how they steer it. And I mention this simply because I value this guy's opinion, even if we don't always agree on things. And I think it does reflect a vocal minority who are concerned about where the story is heading compared to the original, which of course is renowned for its excellent structure and pace that for many gamers didn't need changing. Another thing that came out of this discussion with my friend about how Square are trying to balance new fans and a new experience with the accepted narrative and legacy of the story is the potential for dynamic story arcs and player-determinate endings, which would appease those who want the original game, but also those who want something new and refreshing. And again, it's pure speculation here, but by alluding to Zack's survival, could it be that somewhere down the line a combination of events determine his fate, or players outrightly have to make a decision between Cloud or Zack's survival, or Aerith's survival, or some combination of a difficult eye for an eye decision, which changes the course of a major character's fate? It's an interesting thing to consider based on how the first instalment of the remake concludes. And looking at, for example, episode Ignis, the DLC for Final Fantasy XV, we're already aware that Square has flirted with alternate outcomes and alternate timelines, and based on that, I'm inclined to believe that there could be some DLC alternate timelines where certain events change, or perhaps certain characters, such as Zack or Aerith, get to survive. Now, having said that, again, just like Sephiroth's mystique and Cloud's muddled mind, the death of Aerith is considered by many fans to be part and parcel of the Final Fantasy VII experience, and the very fabric of the story, which, while tragic, is part of the dramatic legacy of the saga that shouldn't be changed. And on this note, there's the mysterious 7 seconds phrase that Sephiroth utters to Cloud in the endgame, which obviously hints at some critical moment in time that has the potential to be altered, and it has many fans believing at this stage that it could refer to the death of Aerith, which has the chance to be averted, and of course has wider implications, down the line, particularly regarding the white materia, and so on. Now, looking at the theme of fate that's prevalent in the remake, it obviously plays a central role, and rather than being a hypothetical, intangible suggestion of fate, it's something that literally manifests in this world in the form of the Whispers. And again, these were quite dubiously received by some, partly because they obstructed gameplay in several places, partly because they were so new and unexpected, and partly because some felt the Whispers represented some cynical metaphor by the writers about legacy fans not wanting the story to change, and that their inclusion was sort of like an FU to traditionalists about trying to cling to legacy events. And while I would expect that behaviour from Hideo Kojima and the Metal Gear Solid series, I'm not sure the Whispers are trying to antagonise traditional fans, and we're not even sure at this stage to what extent the Whispers are trying to retain or change events from the legacy title, excusing a few hints offered in the game that they are trying to keep things as they are. And owing to the fact that we fight them as a penultimate boss, I think there's a strong case to the fact that Sephiroth has exerted a degree of control over them. And digressing slightly, I did read an article recently that highlights the naming conventions for the 3 Whisper bosses in the Japanese version run some parallels with the 3 remnants, Kadaj and so on, seen in Advent Children. And they concluded that further evidence for this is that, both Kadaj and the remnants in the movie and these Whisper bosses culminate in a fight with the summoned Bahamut. So whether or not that's a conscious narrative device or simply a nod to Advent Children that got obscured in translation, it certainly lends to this idea that Sephiroth is in control of the fates, and that they are not merely superfluous narrative devices designed to confuse things or represent angry players. And now the question remains as to whether they've been destroyed or not, and what impact that would have on future events, if of course there is no longer this fixed predetermined path. So, beyond this manifestation of fate in the form of the Whispers, they sit alongside a couple of other characters who are aware of them, and in their own way seem to be trying to exert control over them, with the most prominent being our aforementioned antagonist Sephiroth. And judging by his periodic appearances and the esoteric dialogue he spouts at Cloud, it seems that he's aware of his predetermined path of being defeated at the hands of Cloud. And so, again, viewing this scenario as a sequel and returning to Sephiroth's introduction in the remake, it makes perfect sense that he would now be hounding Cloud and goading him at the beginning of the game, because rather than being an insignificant nobody, Sephiroth is now aware that Cloud has a massive implication on his future demise that he needs to try and change. So, questions remain as to how Sephiroth's doing this and what his intentions are beyond trying not to get killed, because of course the real pursuit of Sephiroth is to reunite with Jenova and conquer the planet. So whether this is a present-day Sephiroth who's attained a forewarning and knowledge about the future, or whether it's a future Sephiroth who's managed to make his way back through time or the lifestream, it's hard to say, but regardless, the endgame events seem to strongly indicate that Sephiroth is aware of and needs to change, shift the course of fate. Although, why he doesn't travel back to his defeat at the Nibelheim reactor isn't clear. Maybe he needed to enter the livestream and arrive at the northern crater and so on. But again, that's pure speculation. And my contention here is simply that this game is best viewed as a sequel rather than a retelling. Now, moving on to another character who seems to have a degree of understanding about the course of fate and the Whispers is Aerith. And I suggested in my Aerith episode and my remake demo review that Aerith could have a renewed significance in this game and a more direct conflict with Sephiroth, owing to the symbolism of her purity and her possession of the white materia, and his malignance and his possession of the black materia. They're very clear contrasts here. And I feel like I can double down on this idea, because if indeed Sephiroth has forewarning about the future, or has travelled through time as Heaven's Dark Harbinger, as it seems, he's fully aware of Aerith's potential obstruction to his plans. So whether this impacts the story, I suppose we'll see. But owing to the One-Winged Angel soundtrack playing when we see Aerith in the alleyway at the beginning of the game, I think this nods that her fate will once again, perhaps more significantly, be tied to Sephiroth, for good or ill, in the future. So there's a few other points regarding the sequel potential that I may be missing, and this is just an initial reaction to how I perceive the game story and how I'm confident that it's a continuity rather than a replacement of the 1997 game. And yeah, it was mostly came out of a conversation with my friend and those that think this game is quite concerning in terms of story. I think rather than being clumsy, it's actually pretty clever and completely validates and incorporates the original 1997 installment into its narrative, with the only people really getting confused being the first-time players, I think, unfortunately. So, Biggs and Wedge surviving, it's not a cop-out. It's the first indication that a huge causal change has taken place, and Sephiroth is holding the reins of destiny that the others need to try and wrestle back from him. And the good thing is that this doesn't necessarily need to change the subsequent narrative touchpoints that take place. We'll probably still get to go to the Chocobo Farm and Calm and Junon and so on. It's simply that there's potential to nudge destiny towards or away from Sephiroth's goals, and key elements such as Zack having implications in the future, which I'm quite intrigued to see. Of course, having said that, there's still potential for this story to go horribly wrong, And don't get me wrong, I love nonsensical time travel. Final Fantasy VIII is my favourite game. But time-meddling narratives are quite hard to do well, and dealing with tangent realities without confusing audiences or simply creating massive plot holes is really difficult to do. Furthermore, does Sephiroth's renewed interest in Cloud and changing destiny cheapen the significance of Jenova and Cloud's muddled mind and the whole history with Zack and so on? Because it's prudent to note that Cloud's messed up mind and visions were slanted more towards Sephiroth than ideas of who he himself is in the remake. But again, because I believe this is a continuity and a sequel to the 1997 game, fans should be expected to know all of this muddling Zack stuff in the first place. And actually, since I've been speaking, my friend has messaged me back saying that he is slightly inclined to feel confident about the idea of it being a sequel, so long as Aerith still dies. That's essential, he says. So that's one opinion. So anyway, wrapping up, there we have it. I'll discuss the remake in a more comprehensive review soon, but this has just been my takeaway on the story so far. And as always, feel free to drop a comment, let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoy the episode, you might like some of my other Final Fantasy analyses available. So please consider subscribing, which will keep you updated with my latest posts.